While I enjoyed the threads of Dark Eyes coming together in box sets 1 and 2, and I was pleased to see the critical acclaim they got, bringing Big Finish a lot more exposure, with a lot more exposure comes creative limitations. Not necessarily a bad thing, so to speak. Creative limitations are always there for a reason, and maybe this is the awkward disagreeable hipster in me speaking here, but when I first stumbled across Big Finish, when their listenership was much lower than it is now, they were doing an entire episode as a fictional news broadcast, Rob Shearman was deconstructing the entire narrative of the show, Nick Briggs was messing about with story structure, and Gary Russell was trying to chew his own feet off. It's like I was a kid at some kind of mad pretentious circus where the elephants had 2 heads, the jugglers had 8 arms, and Current 93 was doing the music. And while Dark Eyes itself started as an experiment in its own kind of way, and yes, I have been enjoying what I've heard recently, I've just been kind of missing the Big Finish that throws caution to the wind more often in this more recent incarnation. The third box set in the Dark Eyes series, while good, it's all Matt Fitton this time round, and the writing's pretty consistent throughout, but it's maybe a little bit too consistent. I'm usually kind of apprehensive these days when Big Finish announce that a box set is going to be either entirely penned by one regular, or almost entirely penned by one regular. I mean, sure, when they've experimented and taken chances in the past, it hasn't always worked, and yes, more eyes are on them these days, but I feel in the case of these high-profile box sets in particular, they would thrive more if they expanded their pool of writers beyond the usual 9 or 10 regulars. Anyway, so The Death of Hope opens Dark Eyes 3 with a lot of what this series has become famous for by this point, mammoth amounts of exposition dumping and technobabble. But after the opening 10 minutes, it does then go on to tell an interesting story set a long way down the line in the war between humanity and the Eminence that's been happening between box sets, of a colony of survivors on a desert planet fending off against the Infinite Warriors, who are visited by the Master, who is gathering information about the Eminence, who brings with him a hypnotised Molly, and AIDS Institute scientist Dr. Sally Armstrong. This is probably one of the bleakest entries in the series. I mean, it's called The Death of Hope, you probably got that. I felt it was an interesting parallel with Great War from Dark Eyes 1, where in this one we have Molly tending to the victims of the war with the Eminence, as opposed to victims of World War I. I did feel it was a damn shame that Ruth Bradley spends most of this box set off-screen and kidnapped, which had to happen less for narrative reasons and more that her schedule was suddenly very busy, as she was off filming Channel 4's Humans, which was excellent by the way while I'm here, and a lot of rewriting must have had to have been done very late in the day. Although, as said, some people may find this one, and by extension most of this box set, a little bit too dour though. And the bleak atmosphere isn't even offset by being trippy as fuck like Heaven Sent was. I mean, yes, Alex McQueen is fucking glorious as the Master as ever, but we have the Doctor watching this scenario play out, powerless to affect the events, and being a fucking miserable bastard while he does so. I do like me some heavy-going, depressing stuff, but I probably would have liked this one in particular a whole lot more if we'd scaled back the technobabble and made it more of a character piece. Cause as is, this one spends quite a lot of the runtime offering us fragments of the Master's plans and baiting us into seeing how it's going to shape up later. I wonder where I could possibly have used that criticism before. Remember kids, recycle your material. Together we can save the environment. So yeah, while I did enjoy Death of Hope, I just didn't feel it grabbed me as harshly as it clearly intended to. Next up we got The Reviled, and it follows pretty much the exact same story structure as last time, but swapping out the Master and Molly for the Doctor and Liv Chenka, who was kinda casually eased into the position of new companion from her first couple of stories in Dark Eyes 2, and she pretty much goes full time to replace Ruth Bradley in Dark Eyes 4. The Reviled's one of the better stories in latter Dark Eyes in my opinion, as it basically plays out like a grimmer version of one of the chirpy talking animal stories from the 8th Doctor adventures. So there's this planet of giant talking insect type things who've rebelled against the human colonists to take back the planet, while the Eminence War rages above them. I kinda thought it might have been a bit more useful to start the box set with this one, rather than the large amount of baiting and setups that went on in Death of Hope, as it offers a small and isolated but very complicated conflict that's a symptom of the grander Eminence War, and it focuses on some different sets of refugees and rebels caught in the crossfire, which is precisely what I want out of a massive scope universe-shaking story with incredibly high stakes. It's not perfect by any means, and yes, as ever, it's filled to the brim with technobabble. Doctor, the retrogenitor antigens are increasing in power! Oh my god, Liv, this means that the flim-flammy McLarvae are hatching inside of the epidermal layer. But the conflict in characters felt very real to me. It's a very alien situation disconnected from Earth and reality, but the factors in place and the way it plays out, in a way that resembles the sort of humanitarian conflict that we recognise from the real world, makes it all the more interesting to me. It is very dour like Death of Hope was, but it's one of the more efficient Dark Eye stories that I'd care to name. Master Plan is next, and it's pretty much the story that the box set was waiting for. Liv has been working inside of a research outpost where Mr. Crazy Professor Dude, whatever his name was, has been working on a piece of technology that will one day inadvertently create the Eminence. And the Doctor shows up to try and stop this from happening in a hope of rewriting the Eminence out of history, but he was beaten there by the villain of this edition, the Vervoids. Sorry, Master. The Master. Why do I always fuck that one up? Anyway, so yeah, the Master shows up, and pretty much the bulk of this one is made up of the Doctor and the Master confronting each other about their current place in the narrative of the Eminence War. And it's an intense few scenes, giving McGann and McQueen the opportunity to show off just how great they both are at the whole acting thing. Though if I had to criticise it, it does still kind of feel like we're hearing a story start rather than continue. While the whole plot of Dark Eyes 3 is a more cohesive experience than the previous two, this one does actually feel like a 4-hour-long space opera movie, but it does feel to me like said artistic intent of the Dark Eyes saga only really surfaced at around the end of writing Dark Eyes 2. I mean, here we are, knee-deep in the second half of it, and it's still exposition dumping and techno-babbling all over the place. Though, as said, McGann and McQueen are so good in this one that I can sort of look past it. Rule of the Eminence finishes up the box set, and not that many people seem to dig this one. Part of that's probably to do with the Master and Doctor confrontation therapy session in Master Plan definitely being the highlight of the box set. Yeah, they kind of blew their load a bit too early in that regard. That and there's... Okay, the concept of visiting a future where the Eminence actually wins the war with humanity, it's a great idea. I particularly loved the possessed newsreader sequences in this one, but to be honest it felt like a bit of a damp squib, because that's an idea to theme an entire box set around. Rule of the Eminence has quarter of a story themed around it, and then it's just sort of over. Basically, the Master's grown a human puppet who's become an incredibly influential politician, and combining that with the technology that he gathered earlier on in the box set, he uses him to place the whole of the Earth under Eminence control. I do totally love the shit out of this idea. The idea of a society in which the majority of people are controlled by the Master using his own version of Eminence gas, there's something kind of 1984 about that, but we don't really focus on that end of it for some reason. I also find it interesting to note here that this one pretty much recreates the Master race scene from The End of Time, and it kind of fixes the big problem that I and lots of people had with this scene in the first place. Does the Master want to actually become everyone else? I would have thought he'd want to control everyone else. Dominating other life forms is kind of his whole deal. I am the Master and you will obey me. Trivial differences maybe, but I've just been finding it's become a running trend in Big Finish recently, in which they take something from New Who that I had issues with, reconstitute it, and kind of fix the big problem that I had with it in the first place. Though it does do the exact same thing as The End of Time, in focusing much more on the Master and our main characters than the actual people affected by the problem. You've essentially created a whole new society here where everyone's under the influence of a universal consciousness. And yet Rule of the Eminence kind of ends up feeling more like Doctor Must Stop Master / other alien, boom, done. It's nowhere near as great as it should have been and gets far too bogged down on the box set's overarching plot, but in its defence, I would say that it was a satisfying enough conclusion to the box set, and weirdly enough, it feels like an actual conclusion. Because Molly leaves. Yeah, the lady with the dark eyes leaves in box set 3 of 4. Yeah, as I said last time, the behind-the-scenes issues that Dark Eyes has are brick to the face levels of blatant. So, here we are, Dark Eyes 4, the final box set, and I feel that if they'd had a bit more time to write this series before the agreed release date, the ending might have been a bit more satisfying to me. This is not to say I was totally dissatisfied with how box sets 3 and 4 turned out, but I just felt that if they'd waited until Ruth Bradley's schedule was a bit freer, and maybe wove these two box sets together a bit tighter, we'd have a stronger conclusion. Because as is, it's a bit of a rigid separation of the players in the Dark Eyes saga. The last box set was primarily about the Eminence, whereas this one brings the Daleks back to centre stage. When I thought the whole point of Dark Eyes was supposed to be one big universal saga, one big picture, wasn't it? So the first of Dark Eyes 4 is A Life in the Day, and I wasn't really sure what to expect from it given Dark Eyes 3 kinda concluded the whole massive epic high-scale bleak war stuff phase of the series. But it still is a bit strange to me that the epic concluding box set starts with a little light-hearted timey-wimey story set in early 20th century London, where the Doctor and Liv stop some funny robots from doing a thing. This was clearly intentional, and done primarily because the third box set makes you want to fucking kill yourself. That and there was also the issue that Liv hadn't exactly had much of a chance to develop much in the way of personality in installments 2 and 3 because the setting was quite urgent and didn't exactly allow for much time for her to say anything other than reams and reams of technobabble. There is this really good bit about halfway through this one where we've got Liv, this character from the far future, going on a date with a guy and pointing out the logical inconsistencies in a Buster Keaton film. It was nice to hear her character given a bit of levity for a change, which makes it more effective when this one takes a dark turn towards the end. It's not a jarring darker turn though, and it serves as a moment to shock you back into the grim nature of Dark Eyes by spending the bulk of the runtime in a story that wouldn't have looked that out of place in the early Charlie era, before pulling a Dark Eyes 3 and warbling about how bleak and horrible everything is. It does kinda work to that purpose, but as said, the way that these box sets flow between each other is a tad disjointed, and it doesn't really wind up sounding like the 16-hour-long universe-encompassing space opera that I thought it was supposed to be, wasn't it? Life in the Day probably is the best in this box set though. The Monster of Montmartre is next up, and we gradually get reintroduced to the plot again. The Dalek Time Controller shows up in early 20th century Paris, testing new Dalek mutants' killing and time perception on the streets at night by setting them against genetically altered humans that he's been experimenting on. It's a cool little story that reappropriates trad horror elements with the Daleks. It's got this cool gothic edge to it, and it wouldn't have looked that out of place during the Mary Shelley cul-de-sac. It also plays about with the Daleks in a very similar way to Great War from Dark Eyes 1. It's very atmospheric and presents the Daleks as these mysterious, dangerous figures that you can hear exterminating in the distance. However, I feel I would have appreciated this story more if it was outside the confines of the layers upon layers of continuity that Dark Eyes deals with on a regular basis. I appreciate that the series has got its own style to it. The stories in this box set each have their own distinctive identity, a lot more so than box set 3, but in the second half of it I just felt a bit let down by it descending back into drawing the Eminence War and pretty much all of the events of box sets 1 and 2 into its conclusion. I know I'm definitely repeating myself, yes, but when the fuck don't I? Long-running elements of a storyline should work to enhance the story at hand, but in the case of this one, I did feel that they were to its detriment. Not to say it's not entertaining, Briggs' Dalek Time Controller's fun as ever, but I just started to lose a bit of enthusiasm for it when it suddenly wandered away from the atmosphere that it spent so much effort weaving in its first half. And yes, I am well aware of the fact that I just criticised this one for doing something that I was confused about the previous story not doing, but my rationalisation for the reaction that I had to these two is that part of me thinks that the Dark Eyes series' intentions were ultimately a bit too lofty for what it could actually achieve. Trying to have a space opera saga and separate entities at the same time is really fucking difficult. That and also my videos contradict themselves all the fuck over the place and you should expect it by now. Deal with it. Master of the Daleks is the penultimate instalment, and it sees the Doctor and Liv separated on a Dalek-occupied alternate version of Earth where they randomly run into some Centaurans, who are here because... reasons. Yet they were all over the advertising for this box set, but they don't really do much. They're pretty much just another alien race that has been impacted by the shit that's going down. And they also run into a hastily recast older version of Molly O'Sullivan from an alternate universe. And... okay, yes, I know that it's kind of lazy that the way that I make characters old is just to give them grey hair, but... come on, how else am I supposed to do it? Just... okay, fuck it, I'll give her a walking stick. You happy now? That's Molly, but old. Done. And we basically spend the runtime cutting between the Doctor, who's gone all crazy and incoherent, who's under the delusional impression that a Dalek is his companion, which is really fun, and there's some really awesome sequences between the Master, the Dalek Time Controller and Liv, where Alex McQueen is just chewing that scenery into a fine paste. Also, the technobabble is scaled back just enough with this one. It's a bit more even-handed than most of box set 3. We got just enough to keep the Dark Eyes overall plot afloat, and just enough character emphasis to give me enough reason to give a shit. In the hands of another writer, it could have been a lot messier than it is, but John Dorney's tongue-in-cheek sense of humour holds it together really well, and I found it thoroughly engaging throughout. And so, we come to the grand finale. Dark Eyes, Eye of Darkness. Yes, they did actually call it that, and no, that title does not get any less stupid the more you say it. Dark Eyes, Eye of Darkness. And I'd like to sum up this one with an appropriate little visual metaphor. Okay, bring it in. Little further. That's it. And release. Okay, that's a little bit unfair of me, yes. Eye of Darkness's central concept isn't exactly a bad one. A peaceful sanctuary at the heart of the Orion system, acting as a sort of haven for refugees from interplanetary wars, turns out to be secretly occupied as a Dalek weapons R&D centre, where the Dalek Time Controller, the Doctor, Molly and Liv show up for the Time Controller's final comeuppance for meddling in the affairs of time and space. It's a great idea, and it contains one of the best performances from Briggs as the Dalek Time Controller. I should mention that the crafting of a Dalek that stays true to the race's purpose of being inhuman killing machines while showcasing an actual distinctive character is something to be applauded. But the only problem is that Eye of Darkness is the big culmination of everything that Dark Eyes has done so far, and if I said it didn't fail to live up to that, I would be lying to myself and the rest of you. It completely fucking drowns in the previous 15 hours worth of continuity. The Dark Eyes series has a beautiful scope, but the behind the scenes problems added to having to tie literally every single tiny little thing together, I just don't think it would ever really feel like the high impact climax that To the Death was after all of that. To me, it kind of ended up feeling more like slotting things into place purely for the sake of slotting them into place. Oh, I did enjoy it, yes, don't get me wrong, but it was just a satisfactory enough ending to the saga. Oh my god, I'm so conflicted. God, I feel like my brain's gonna fucking split in half. So yeah, that was Dark Eyes, and while I didn't think it was as satisfying as the previous two eras, and it's less the cohesive 16-part story than it tries to make you think, particularly when listening back to the whole thing from start to finish, but I did feel like I got my money's worth.